This is the November meeting as regularly scheduled of the Historical Society of Frankfurt. And we're pleased to have everybody that's joining us. We hope there's many of you out there remotely. We have some here as well. Our topic tonight is the history of the government-sponsored school lunch program. And our speaker is Dr. Jesse Smith, who is the Director of Curatorial Affairs and Digital Content at the Science History Institute here in Philadelphia. He has a distinguished academic background and professional career prior to his current job, but his current job speaks for itself, I think. I have personally been a frequenter of the Science History Institute from time to time for many years, and I can vouch for it that whatever corporate sponsorship they may have, they have never shown me a moment of bias, skewed science in their presentations, and I'm very impressed with that. And also the fact that they're able to present their exhibitions in a way that is understandable for somebody that just walks in off the street, as opposed to a specialist that's coming to do research. Although they certainly have research, they have good special collections there as well for the specialists. So we're real pleased to have Dr. Smith here for this talk. He did this. What he's basing his program on tonight is an exhibition that he's just put up at the Science History Institute on the history of the school lunch program. Now, some of our most loyal Historical Society of Frankfurt followers may become confused when you hear the surname Smedley at some point in this program. This is, I'm sorry to say, not one of the Frankfurt Smedleys. The Smedleys do, in fact, go back to a grant from William Penn, but the original land grant was not in Philadelphia. It was in one of the collaring counties. And the same thing is true of the descendant that is mentioned in this talk. She is not a Frankfurt person. She's a cousin of ours. I say ours. We claim the Smedleys here. We're very proud of the Frankfurt Smedleys because two of them, Frederick and Caroline, were two of the 8 founders of this society in 1905. And in 1908, Frederick became our second president, which lasted until 1924, so long-term commitment there. Caroline was even longer. She was his cousin, and she was our secretary for even longer. She wrote his obituary eventually, Frederick's, and Frederick's brother William proceeded to buy the land that we're sitting on here right now and build the building that we're occupying right now with the money that the family had made in the lumber industry here around Frankfurt. And that's a great big piece of why we're still standing as a relatively small neighborhood historical society, whereas most of the other ones in the country have failed over the last 30 years. Plus, of course, the dedication of small cadre of really dedicated volunteers. So that's that story. We have an introduction written in 1916 by a great American poet. Lost it already. Should have this printed out. Doggone it. Here we go. Oh, I'm not connecting. I can't do it. Okay, never mind then. So with that, Dr. Smith will give us his account of the history of the school lunch program. And thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction and for the invitation to present tonight. To begin, I'll give you a brief orientation to the Science History Institute. We are a museum and library in Old City, Philadelphia. We have a permanent exhibition, but we also host temporary exhibitions, of which Lunchtime is one. We also have a very large, I'll just keep going. Okay. Fellowship program, historians, researchers who come into our library to access our materials for their own work, large oral history collection, rare book collection, archival collection, and oral histories. And the work that I do is interpreting those collections for broad public audiences. And I'm glad to hear your comment about the accessibility of the work that we do for our public audiences, because we really want to bring the history of science to more and more individuals. And in doing so, we're really exploring the ways in which the scientific knowledge that we've generated of the world has shaped that world. And that's very true here in the case of the school lunch program in the United States. So what I'm going to do this evening is walk us through the exhibition and through the history of this program. And we've divided the exhibition into 5 distinct sections, 5 distinct periods. And even though the school lunch programs in the United States begin in 1894, we actually begin the history of this program far earlier, in the middle of the 18th century and the 19th century. And what we're doing in this first section is looking at the emergence of new ways of understanding food, health, nutrition, bodies in the 1700s and in the 1800s. This was work done by figures such as Lavoisier in France, so studying the body and the processes that occur in the body, new understandings of the role of food in providing energy to the body. And let me back up and just say these I'll explain these images. On the left is an image from our collection of Lavoisier's calorimeter, which he used to study the relationships between bodies, respiration, and heat. And on the right is an actual exhibition label from Lunchtime. So this was a design choice that we made to use the convention of notebook paper. We, across the exhibition, invoked spaces and objects from schools. And so that's what you're seeing here. There were a couple of reasons for this new approach, this new scientific approach to food and eating and cooking. One was grounded in industrialization. You have, in Europe and the United States, more and more people moving to cities to work in growing factories, and there was concern over having enough food to feed these growing populations. But also there was increased scrutiny over what exactly was required of by the laboring body. And so what you're seeing here, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you're able to see these labels, but we have work done by we're exploring work done by a series of scientists who are providing new understandings of metabolism that are beginning to divide foods into categories that are more familiar to us today. So categories of macronutrients like carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, new understandings of the importance of variety in a diet. There are also militaristic impulses behind these new scientific understandings of food and bodies. And what you're looking at here is an object from our rare book collection, one of the earliest manuals for canning as a food preservation technology. And this was written by an individual who, a French individual who participated in a contest that was launched by Napoleon. Are you familiar with this history? Napoleon looking for a way to better ensure an adequate and sustained supply of food for troops. So not only are we looking at new scientific understandings of food, but new food technologies as well. As I said, new understandings of metabolism. This is an apparatus designed for the study of metabolism. You might be able to see the dog in the chamber on the left, and ultimately these kinds of analytical techniques were brought to human bodies as well. Beyond the new scientific approaches to food and health, in the United States, there's also increased federal support for this kind of research. So a lot of the research that's happening on food in laboratories, in research sites is in the 1700s, early 1800s is happening in Europe. And in 1862, the federal government establishes the United States Department of Agriculture, and this becomes a major source of research, primarily on agricultural goods, foods. It also involves the creation of land-grant colleges, so new sites for research, teaching in engineering, in military science, and agricultural science at new schools, places like Penn State. And also the establishment of extension services to further this scientific research. So you have this in the 1860s, this immense amount of government support that's coming to this kind of work. The first head of the extension service was an individual, a scientist named Wilbur Atwater. And what you're looking at here is an image from Atwater's own research. This is an instrument called a calorimeter, a human calorimeter. Individuals would enter this chamber in the center. I'm sorry, you're not able to see my cursor. And the photos on the left, the black and white photos, those are staged photos, but they are demonstrating the kinds of tests that were being done. So an individual washing clothes, someone else eating lunch, in order to understand the energy needs of the body for doing those kinds of work. And Atwater is responsible for giving us the calorie as the unit of energy that we still use today for understanding food. So you have all these new ways of thinking about food, right? Thinking in terms of the quantification of food, thinking of food according to its individual components. We also have, in the second half of the 1800s and the early 1900s, increased fears over the quality of food, especially due to those processes of industrialization, the demographic shifts that were happening across the country, folks moving farther and farther away from their sources of food traveling farther and farther distances. There's increased opportunities for adulteration. And what you're seeing here are some of the instruments from our collection that are used in the study of food quality and efforts to understand food purity. Maybe this image will be a little bit clearer. This is a book from our rare book collection, a treatise on the adulteration of food and culinary poisons, exhibiting the fraudulent sophistications of bread, beer, wine, liquors, tea, coffee, and so on. And I think this nice images here on the left, you can see at the top the saying, under the skull there's death in the pot, and also on the page on the right. So we're drawing on our collection of rare books in this category to again tease out this dimension of scientific understandings of food in this period. So that's the first section of Lunchtime. And in the second section, we begin to look at the emergence of school feeding programs in the 1890s. And there's a couple of motivations behind these efforts. The first is concern over the state of children in this period, growing concern over child labor, also the health and safety of children living in growing cities, fears about exposure to vice, to unclean water, unclean air. There's also increased recognition of childhood as a distinct stage of life, as different from adulthood, and requiring different forms of care, different attentions to health. You also have the rise of compulsory education in the late 19th century. Massachusetts is the first state to pass a compulsory education law, and soon after, the rest of states do, that are requiring children to spend some time in school, even though the implementation of this is very idiosyncratic from state to state. But those children are spending more time away from the home and in the care of the state. We also have the emergence of efforts that have been identified as municipal housekeeping, and this is the expansion of labor, largely women's labor in the home, out into the community. And this involved things like the creation of playgrounds and kindergartens and shared kitchens, shared laundries, also the advocacy for clean water, for clean air. Parallel to the emergence of municipal housekeeping was the emergence of home economics. So the application of scientific practices, scientific principles to domestic labor, things like cooking and cleaning. Whoops. I might need to click that. I think I may have hit something on the PowerPoint that's not allowing me to advance. Apologies for that. Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you. So you can see that the work of home economists captured in some objects from our collections here. So this is Chemistry of the Household, a manual from the American School of Home Economics, the chemistry of cooking and cleaning. So really thinking very scientifically about these forms of domestic labor and care. The earliest school lunch programs in the United States began in 1894 in Boston and Philadelphia in the same year. In Philadelphia, it was a volunteer effort at one school in South Philadelphia, an organization that we might think of as a PTA today, a Parents Teachers Association. In Boston, it was the work of Ellen Richards, a pretty prominent home economist, and a promoter of the field, but also a proponent of the work of eugenics, which was parallel to the work of eugenics, but was about so-called improvement through changes to the social conditions in which people lived and worked. These efforts continued in very idiosyncratic ways for several years. And then in 1910, the Philadelphia School District hired the woman who you see on the right, this is Emma Smedley, as the first full-time school employee dedicated to school lunches in Philadelphia. She was wildly successful. The program grew very rapidly. The school district was quick to provide Smedley with significant resources for her to spread the cooking and serving of school lunches to many individual schools across the city. She also became a fairly prominent leader in the field. In 1930, she wrote a significant manual on the operation of a school kitchen and cafeteria. There really were no materials prior to this book for helping individuals who were new to the field learn what they needed to do. So she was really a significant figure in defining the field of school lunch labor. There were also in this period of the early 1900s smaller efforts in rural schools. What you're looking at here are some images of a technology called a fireless cooker that was available for schools that did not have access to a kitchen. I think I have a photo. And this is a fireless cooker that's in our collection. So food would be heated on a stove for a few minutes at the beginning of the day and then put into this insulated case where it would continue to cook and stay warm so that students had a hot meal at lunchtime. So these efforts, early 1900s, late 1800s, are largely volunteer run at first, and again, very idiosyncratic. They're different state to state and school district to school district. And there were still many, many schools that did not provide lunches in this period. In the third section of the exhibition, we look at the emergence of federal involvement in school lunches. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that there are really rapid transformations in agriculture in this period. New fertilizers, new seed varieties that are increasing agricultural productivity. What you're looking at here is a hybrid seed corn bag that is on loan to us from the Henry Ford in Michigan, and then also fertilizer samples that we have in our collection. Let me see if you can see this. There's also, at the same time, new scientific understandings of food, furthering our knowledge of what we're eating and how it works in the body. So new understandings of vitamins and micronutrients. On the left here is a comic book from our collection that's exploring the story of Dr. Goldberger and his work to identify the source of the disease pellagra. And what's significant about this kind of work in the early 20th century in beginning to recognize diseases of nutritional deficiencies is that we're learning, okay, it's not only what can go into a body, something like a germ that can cause ill health, but we can have poor health outcomes from things that are missing from the body. The recognition that there are minimum needs for macro and micronutrients. And then in this panel in the center here, we're turning to the Great Depression, and this is a real key moment in the history of U.S. school lunches. When agricultural prices, due to this increased productivity, start to decline, the federal government steps in and buys a significant number of agricultural surpluses. Its first move is to destroy those goods, and this causes a rapid public outcry. What the feds do is they continue to buy those surpluses, but then they begin distributing them to schools, but to other sites. So making that food available for the population struggling under the Great Depression. Oh, here's an image from the comic that I just referenced. that panel. So the provision of surplus goods is the first step that the federal government takes. The next is to make available labor through the WPA program. So the federal government begins supporting workers, largely women, who are put into schools to serve lunches in many places where lunches had never been provided before. I will say that the distribution of this labor and these resources was very unequal across the country, and not every student had access to these federally supported foods and meals. World War II deepens federal involvement in school lunches, as well as concerns for the nutritional health of the country overall. I think on the left here, this is a quite evocative poster where you have this iconic image of Uncle Sam with the fork and the food, and the silhouette of the family. So there's concern not only for the health and nutrition of individuals going abroad to fight in World War II, but also for those who were on the home front, filling factory jobs, but also concern for young people as the next generation of laborers and potentially fighters. The scientific work on food and nutrition continues. This is an image of Lydia Roberts, a home economist who led the government's efforts during World War II to create to establish recommended daily allowances for specific nutrients. So RDAs, things that are still with us today, determining what are the minimum numbers of micronutrients and macronutrients that the body needs. We also see new categorizations of foods. When I was growing up, it was the 4 food groups. In World War II, the government clustered foods into these 7 groups. This was actually a reduction from the first effort to create food groups, which had 14 food groups. So these are efforts to try to help people think about how to maximize the variety in their diet, but also to be exposed to the most macro and micronutrients possible. We also, in the exhibition, this is an oven, a commercial oven and mixer that were donated to us by the school district of Pennsylvania, or I'm sorry, the school district of Philadelphia, and we use it as an opportunity, almost a mini theater, to show short film clips from the 40s and 50s around wartime nutrition, good eating habits, food groups, and so on. In the fourth section of the exhibition, we move to the formalization of the federal government's involvement in school lunches. That photo in the center is President Truman in 1946 signing the National School Lunch Act, which established a school lunch program. It continued to provide agricultural surpluses to schools. It allowed the USDA to set nutritional standards, and it set a reimbursement rate for meals. So the amount of money that the federal government would supply directly to schools for the provision of school lunches. This is due in part to continued agricultural improvement. These are a few fertilizers and chemicals that would have been used in the mid-century that led to those continued surpluses and the government's interest in preserving farm prices. This is a watercolor from our collection called Fertility from 1951, which I think nicely captures the thinking around the relationship between chemistry, science more broadly, and agriculture in the period. And this is a comic book, The Conquest of Hunger, featuring Prosper Plenty and his magic chemicals, which has a bag of fertilizer and 2 children backed by scientists, farmers, all chasing the Grim Reaper. So a significant amount of, it's a pretty fun artifact, but nicely capturing the belief in science and technology to address address hunger, food insecurity in this period, but also speaks to ongoing federal involvement in the agricultural economy and the school lunch program as, in part, a means of protecting those economic interests. We're also exploring in this section new federal research into food that would ultimately make its way into school lunches. So this is a gas chromatograph. It's an instrument that separates samples into their individual components that can then be identified and measured. And this was an analytical technique that was really critical to the successful commercialization of frozen foods in the middle of the 20th century. For several decades, the techniques for freezing food were available, but the quality was so poor that there was not much of a commercial market for foods preserved with this particular technology. In the 1950s, the U.S. government establishes 4 field research stations across the country that are tasked with identifying new uses for agricultural goods, for increasing the commercialization and profitability of certain categories of foods. And one of those research projects was called time temperature trials for frozen foods. And it was research that was intended and was ultimately successful at identifying the range of temperatures that frozen foods could be subjected to and for what amount of time, so that and still maintain their quality. And the gas chromatograph here was used to measure and quantify the chemicals, the gases that were associated with poor taste, poor smell. So you could use this instrument to basically identify scientifically whether a particular frozen food was of good or poor quality once it was prepared. Some of that other research here on the left involved research into the dehydration of foods. So out of federally funded research labs came dehydrated potatoes or instant mashed potatoes, which became a staple of school lunches in many places. And in the center here, we're looking at new food packaging technologies. So the development of plastic wraps that were used not only in schools and other industrial and commercial kitchens, but in homes as well, as ways of extending the life of foods. Across the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the U.S. school lunch program was wildly popular. However, it really did not reach as many students as the public believed, and access to the school lunches remained very unequal across the country. And in part, this was due to the design of the legislation. When senators and congresspeople were advocating for the school lunch legislation in the 1940s, they were adamant, especially those representing the South, they were adamant that control and administration of these programs remain with state and local governments. And this is because, in large part, they were worried that this was the federal government's way of intervening in schools to ultimately end segregation. And the only way they would throw their support behind this legislation was if states and local governments could retain control, which is something that continues today. They were also adamant that it remain in the Department of Agriculture, reflecting in large part those agricultural interests, but that's also something that persists today. There are advocates who would prefer to see the school lunch program as part of the Department of Education, but it still remains with the USDA. In the 1960s, as part of the war on poverty, there's a significant effort to understand the scale of poverty and of hunger in the country. Let me see if I have. Okay, go back. There's an image of Johnson, the sepia image, and then the image of the two women on the right. On the top is Jean Fairfax. She was an organizer with the NAACP, and in the late 1960s, a cohort of women's group came together and hired Fairfax to lead a survey of school lunch programs in the country. And in '68, they released a report called Their Daily Bread, which brought to popular attention the inequities of the school lunch program, and also called for increased funding for school lunches. There were calls also for a universal school lunch program. And then the woman on the bottom is Molly Orshensky, who was a statistician with the government, who developed what became known as the poverty line, grounded in research on the prices of food and what it would cost for a family to acquire the minimum amount of food that was suggested by the USDA for a healthy diet. And in the late 1960s, that poverty line became the basis for determining who in the country was eligible for free or reduced price lunches. That work continued into the 1970s. On the left is a picture of Richard Nixon, who at the beginning of his term convened a White House conference on food, nutrition, and health, and worked with Congress to vastly expand the amount of federal funds that were available for food relief programs in the 1970s, including school lunches, but other programs as well. You also have some other pretty significant changes in school lunch programs in the 1970s. The USDA begins allowing private enterprises to enter school cafeterias and sell their goods, but to operate school lunch programs. You have new technologies. On the right is a TV dinner that we have in our collection, the packaging and tray, at least. This was a technology that was developed in World War II in order to provide hot meals to troops on overseas flights. Soon after the war, it was adopted by airlines and then the makers of TV dinners. And then ultimately, these kinds of meals made their ways into schools and other institutions like hospitals, prisons. This is a photo on the upper right of a Philadelphia school with stacks of these frozen pre-made meals that they, in the photo caption, identify as in-flight style meals being cooked being warmed in a large commercial oven. And this is a technology that's still with us today. About half of the schools in Philadelphia are satellite schools that receive on a daily basis pre-plated frozen meals that are warmed on site. The other half of schools here in Philadelphia have conventional kitchens and cafeterias. We also see across the 1970s and into the 1980s growing concern not only for individuals who might not be getting enough food, but also for those who may be getting too many of the so-called bad foods and bad food elements, so things like salt and sugar and fat. The bulletin on the left, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, these were first issued from the USDA in 1980 and are updated every 5 years until and through today. This is something that the government still produces and updates. You also see new ways of understanding foods, the emergence of the food pyramid in the 1990s. Also, there's the obligatory content about ketchup. Whenever we talk with individuals about the history of school lunch, ketchup seems to be the one thing that everyone asks about or knows about. So we were sure to include that in the exhibition. And this was I'll just be brief about this, but this was a moment in the early 1980s when the Reagan administration was attempting to reduce the amount of federal funds that were being used for school lunches, and also reducing the recommended portions of school lunches in order to justify those lower costs, but also recategorizing foods, potentially recategorizing foods. Ketchup was never actually mentioned. It was pickled relish, and the story started to spin out of control and became the ketchup anecdote that we know today. This is an object that we acquired for the exhibition. It's a 1973 board game called Super Sandwich, and it's based on those new and changing dietary guidelines from the USDA. Players tasked with trying to create a super sandwich that meets the USDA's RDAs, with a whole host of other activities mixed in there, activities that can that shed calories, that players can be thwarted by buying snacks and fruits. So it embodies all that understanding of like contemporary understanding of food and nutrition, but in gameplay. This was also an object, the table donated to us by the School District of Philadelphia. It had been used in a cafeteria, and we used it as a space to create an infographic, a diagram of how food makes its way into Philadelphia schools, beginning with funding from the USDA, how that funding makes its way through state departments in the state of Pennsylvania and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. School lunches are administered in part through the State Department of Agriculture and in part through the Department of Education. But this is particular to Pennsylvania. In other states, different agencies administer the program. I will say I was blown away in doing the research for this exhibition by just how idiosyncratic school lunches are across the country, state by state, district by district. It's really difficult to come up with any characterization of this program as it's actually implemented on the ground. So this explores the movement of data, of money, ordering down to those satellite schools on the left, which make up 45% of Philly schools. Those are the schools that get the pre-plated frozen meals, and then the full service schools on the right, which are about 55% of schools. And then finally, we look at changing standards over the past couple of decades. The largest changes to school lunch standards have come in the Clinton and Obama administrations. But just this spring, the USDA released updated nutritional guidelines, further reducing salt and added sugar to school lunches, pushing for more whole grains with some exceptions for what they call culturally specific foods like white rice and flour tortillas. But you may have encountered this in April or May in the news. This is work that continues up until the present moment, and debates over school lunches continue. You might have noticed that in the presidential campaign, this came up several times, especially because Minnesota was a state that recently created a universal school lunch program. There's about 10 in the country right now, where every student in that state has access to a free school lunch, and that is an effort that seems to be growing more on the state level. There doesn't seem to be a tremendous push for it to happen on the federal level. So that's the arc of the exhibition and the history of school lunch, as we're telling it through the lens of the history of science and trying to understand how our knowledge of bodies, of health and nutrition, as well as new food technologies have informed and shaped those feeding programs. But I thought I'd briefly just give you a sense of how we put on an exhibition like this, how we come to tell this history in physical space. And it starts with our collections. We have a large collection of objects related to food science. And a few years ago, as we were developing our exhibition calendar, we were thinking, what kind of story do we want to tell with this? We could have told a history of food science, of laboratories and scientists, but we thought, what if we try to find a way that might be more familiar, more legible, maybe more surprising? And we settled on the school lunch as a topic for this show. And what you're seeing here is just one part of our object list for this exhibition. So we gathered everything that we had related to food science. But how do you put these in an order? How do you frame them? How do you think about what goes around these objects? So then what I do as the curator is come up with a content outline that captures all of the research that I've done, but also attempts to start placing those artifacts into this larger narrative. So you might see on the upper left, we're thinking, what are the parts of the story that need to be told through graphics, through text and images? What can be told through artifacts, either from our own collection or from other collections? What media pieces might we want to bring in, things like films or touch screens? And then we attempt to plot all of that out into some kind of order, begin making choices about periodization and different sections, and where should one story end and the next begin, and thinking about what kinds of things we want to say with each of those pieces without doing any exhibition label writing or anything like that. That outline then goes to our exhibition designer. We work with external designers who attempt to plot that outline into our physical space. Where is that going to go in our gallery? And this was a very early concept diagram from last summer as we were preparing an application to Pew for funding for the show, which we were lucky to achieve. But yeah, this is just about getting all of those elements into physical space. We also start thinking about what's the look and feel of this exhibition going to be? What kinds of colors might we use? What are things we've done in the past that we would like to draw from again? What are other museums and food-related exhibitions doing? So some of these are images of past exhibitions at the Science History Institute. Some are images from archival collections like the Library of Congress, and others are photographs that we've taken, team members have taken in visiting other exhibitions. This is another image that gives you a sense of kind of early thinking about look and feel. And we were thinking, it'd be really nice to invoke the spaces of schools and cafeterias as much as possible. Things like tables and benches and tray rails. And then once we have that, we begin actually writing the exhibition script. So this is a portion of the script from that section related to Truman's signing of the National School Lunch Act with the fertilizer and the watercolor, but also other images. And we begin thinking about, what's the tone, what's the voice, what are the specific things that we actually want to say about these pieces. And then this gets further iterated into design. What are the choices that we're going to make about the presentation of that information? And then finally, we come up with more refined plans. These are the kinds of documents that our installers use to know exactly where to place these elements in physical space, according to desired visitor flow, but according to ADA requirements as well, so that all individuals are able to move freely through the space and experience it. And then, here, this is the tray rail that we installed as the opening of the exhibition with fake food that we purchased through a variety of sites and historic milk containers that we also purchased as well. So lots of props to invoke the experience of the school cafeteria. So that's Lunchtime. We opened the exhibition in late September of this year. Our museum will actually be closed in January and February for a large construction project, but we will reopen in March, and the exhibition will be up through January of 2026. So just over a year from now, so plenty of time to see it. So hopefully we'll be able to see you at the Science History Institute Museum sometime soon, either for this exhibition or for one of the programs or talks that we have. So thank you again for the invitation, and happy to take any questions from anyone in the room or if there's anyone online. Thank you. Yes?
There's something called teaching to the text. But skipping that, I don't know if there's any feedback you have back to the Philadelphia schools for suggestions. For instance, you might have they have a rooftop garden where they actually grow vegetables, they actually have home economics, basically including like finance, but also like nutrition study. It could be directly in the curriculum for high schools. It could be the only teacher that's task, but you could suggest it anyway, or you only see, like, you're getting input from the other people to you, can you give suggestion back to the school system?
Yeah, I'll be honest that I feel really hesitant about offering any feedback. I worked really closely with several members of the Division of Food Services, and these are very passionate and hardworking people who are working with limited resources, or not as many resources as they would like. One of the things that I was really surprised by was it was unexpected to me the amount of feedback they're attempting to get from students. So, yeah, they have every year a food show where they're debuting or they're sharing potential new foods and getting student feedback to see if the students like that. They also have an app where they encourage students to rate the foods, so that. Exactly, because they really want the students to eat the foods. And there's different efforts over the course of the city. The agricultural high school that is producing food, not at any scale that could be used for the school district. We also are working with a group out of West Philly called Rebel Ventures, and they're associated with the Netter Center for Community Partnerships at UPenn. And they're an entrepreneurial group that developed what's called a food product called the Rebel Crumble, and this is available for in the district for breakfasts. It meets the dietary guidelines for school breakfast. So there are these efforts happening across the district. I think the biggest interventions are going to come on the state and federal level, and that's where the biggest challenges seem to be. Yes.
You mentioned mandatory attendance. You mentioned mandatory attendance, kind of spotty around the country, I guess, at the time. Have you figured out when grade 1 through 12 free public education became generally available across the United States?
That's a really good question. I know that by the 1930s, almost every state had a compulsory education law, but I don't know what range of grades that represented. Very early on in these laws, the mandate was for the earlier grades and for younger children to be in school, and it would taper off. But I'm not sure. I could get the answer to this question, but I don't know now at what point K to 12 became the standard and the norm. But it's a good question.
The school lunch program is still included in the agriculture department.
That is.
Is it hidden, or is it easy to pick out and pull away and throw out?
Oh, it's not hidden. I think that and as an individual could go to the USDA website and find the specific data on the number of children that are fed, the reimbursement rates, the standards. All that information is publicly available. It could be pulled from the budget. I think that my suspicion is that its support for the agricultural economy is one of the things that helps protect it, because there's an economic incentive to preserving it. But there are significant debates over access to free and reduced price school lunches.
I guess, John, you want to do a...
Yeah, a little bit of closing.
Well, thank you.
We're taking this January and February off too. We will be back though in December. Susan Cavrour is going to talk in December, second Tuesday of December, 7:30, starting time for the broadcast as usual. She's going to talk about early photography in Frankfurt. She has a book just about ready to produce. We're very proud of Susan. And so we will hope that you'll join us then, and then start up again with us in March of the coming year. And in the meantime, bear in mind getting to this exhibition that you just heard about. If you can, take some friends if you can. It's time to educate all your friends on the value of the school lunch program, and I think this exhibition is helpful in that regard. Thank you. Come back and see us.